we're just summon like no other creature type. Equipped to.
Anyway,
so this is the first time I think we've flavored as a zombie.
Putting flashback spells wasn't no one fought that.
So the idea here is what happens there in Magic was we sort of made a decision like this is making reference to the card transformation.
Hey, do you have a couple minutes to talk about our new intern?
Who, Mark?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about some of the cards he's developing.
Yeah, the dude's super enthusiastic. I'm not sure what you're worried about.
Well, take a look at this card.
If a spell or ability would double any effect, it doubles it twice instead. I mean, yeah, that's a little ambitious, but there's probably some room for it somewhere, in some commander deck or something.
Yeah, but check out this stack of cards.
Squirrel Captain, Squirrel Recruit, Chittering Tide, Commander of Squirrel, Baron of Bushy Tails, Master of the Squirrel Trident, Nut Hoarder, Squirrel Through Hell, Squirrel Quarreler, Squirrel Lake Ancient, Nutso, the Squirrel God, Squirrel Loon Minotaur. Okay, I mean, he seems a little preoccupied with a particular theme.
Well, I'm really mostly concerned about this card, though.
Okay, I mean, a 4/4, Flying Vigilance, that's pretty vanilla.
Check out the mana cost.
Oh, God. 3 green black? Mark!
Okay, hell. But anyway,
would you step into my office, please?
I'm a zombie fan. I remember
Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my ever-present co-host, Anthony, bonafide dual citizen Maddox.
I don't know if we need to talk about that.
You don't want to disclose? Don't want to disclose? Anthony may or may not be a bona fide dual citizen of some other country. I won't tell you which one. Write in and guess, and I will never verify whether you're right or wrong.
Just planting some seeds of mystery here.
I've always been a little jealous of your dual citizenship. It seems like a nice backup plan, you know? Sometimes maybe you don't totally trust in the stability of your country, and it's like, you know, it'd be nice to have a second country to fall back on.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's really impacted my life in any meaningful way, except for, occasionally it's like, I could just get up and get the fuck out if necessary.
Just the thought that you could do it. Like, not that you ever will necessarily, but just that idea that you could is like very freeing, I feel like.
Definitely. I mean, there are ways out.
Oh, that's really mysterious. We're not going to go at all into depth there. The reason I bring up your alleged dual citizenship, Joe Anthony, is because we are not alone on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We are joined from around the globe, all the way from Belgium, which is or is not the country you have a dual citizenship to. We will never tell, by Jason Waddell of Riptide Lab. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me. And I have to apply for my son's dual citizenship before he is 18. So I will put that off as long as possible.
TikTok, Jason. You better get on that. Oh, well, we're so excited to have you on the show. It's been oft requested. I would say you are probably the most requested guest on the show. We've been talking about it for ages and just never made it happen. So we're really glad to have you. You've been kind of in and out of the Magic world recently, but I got to say I think you are one of the progenitors of Cube content. I think it's like you and What Wolf are kind of like the original forefathers of the format as far as writing about it, making videos about it, publishing things about it, talking about Cube from a theoretical perspective. And so, I feel like here at Lucky Paper, we really stand on the shoulders of giants and very excited to have you on the show.
Oh, that's very flattering, but there were plenty that came before me. I mean, when I started, there was Evan Irwin, Usman Jamil, Justin Parnell,
oh, right.
probably others. So I don't think I was like the first generation of Cuber content creators by any means.
I guess that speaks to my relative youth. I'm a Zoomer. I'm a Cube Zoomer. You predate my time significantly, and so I guess that is why I have this perception of you being there since the original days.
Well, that's in a way flattering. I sometimes have people still find my articles from 2013, which is weird because I'm not reading any 2013 Magic articles. I don't know what kind of Google searches people are doing to dig those up, but...
Although, to be fair, I think that's one of the things that is so interesting and exciting about Cube is that content still can be relevant. I mean, you can't really read about Modern or Legacy or definitely not Standard or Limited from that time and still have useful content. But Cube is this interesting space where we really can make it about whatever we want, and those sort of design concepts can still carry over.
Or even you kind of have to. It is possible to write higher level, more broadly applicable articles about other formats of Magic, more broadly speaking. Like you think about Who's the Beatdown and, some of these classic, like the Tempo article by PVDDR. Like it's possible, but it's so much easier to just write about whatever's going on in that format at the time, do a deck tech. There's much lower hanging fruit in terms of content for other formats. But I feel like with Cube, if you're not addressing it in a way that it will still be relevant in 10 years, then it's probably not the most valuable contribution to what Cube can be.
Can I say something that I find immensely unsatisfying?
Yes.
That is...
Welcome to the Gripes Corner.
Yeah.
Saltbox. We call it Saltbox. Go ahead.
Okay, so if you go through my Channel Fireball article archive, there is I think there's an article called Cons of Tarkir Cube Set Review Part 1 with no follow-up, which to me, I don't know, when I was making a lot of YouTube videos, I kind of felt the pressure to be on that content grind and to cover all the new cards and sets that came out. It doesn't do a lot for me, and I think it kind of burned me out a little bit.
Yeah, so when are we going to get part 2? I mean, if part 1 is there alone, I got to ask the question, when is part 2 coming? You got to be working on it still. It must be really great.
Yeah, it's going through its 12th edit, so we're trying to finalize it before. No, so it's probably not coming. There's a lot of things that have been dropped by the wayside, but I feel like I really felt it during Modern Horizons 2 spoiler season, that there was just so much that it felt like there was an obligation to talk about. Or Dom Harvey, I put him through, must have been 3.5, 4 hours of podcast of reviewing that. And I don't think that I personally felt strongly about as many cards as I talked about. There were a lot of cards that were kind of covered because they're strong, and that's traditionally what's talked about in Cube discourse are the new strong cards. I don't know. I didn't feel it in that way. And I'm wondering how you guys maintain your passion for the endless spoiler season that we're in.
Well, this is actually something I did want to talk about, because you kind of come and go from the public Cube discourse, and you've been on a bit of an outswing in the past couple months. We've been talking behind the scenes about that, and I know you've got some other stuff you're working on. But I think this burnout is very real, and it's not something you hear talked about relative to people's hobbies very often. I feel like you hear about burnout relative to work all the time. It's people that burned out at work, blah, blah, blah. That's a, tale as always time that I think is probably got some different symptoms and different side effects than burnout from a hobby. But I do think it's actually possible to get burned out by a hobby, which is weird because, the only reason we do a hobby is because we enjoy it. And so, why are you doing a thing if doing it is burning you out? But I've definitely had times where I felt more or less into Magic and the idea of having to be up on the latest stuff. Modern Horizons 2 was a high watermark for the amount of cards we had to talk about on the podcast and in the Cube world in general, because, the supplemental sets, they're not core regular sets. So Wizards doesn't put them in the schedule of regular sets. So we had the regular sets, which were Strixhaven, then Modern Horizons 2, then Adventures in Forgotten Realms. And just in between there, without making any real space for it, they stuck Modern Horizons 2, which, of course, for us was just as relevant, if not more relevant, than a regular set for most Cube designers, but didn't have the appropriate, 3 months that most sets usually get to kind of take up the limelight before it was already spoiler season again for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. I'm curious to know, what does that burnout mean for you, Jason? Is it purely just a feeling of having to keep up, or a feeling of having to produce content, or is it actually just come down to actually playing Magic? Even if you just put your blinders on, stop looking at the internet, pretended there were no more sets coming out, were you also burned out in the sense that you didn't feel compelled to play your Cube and just play the game anymore?
Well, I wonder if burnout is even the right word for it. I have an analogy in my head, but it's kind of what's the rating of this podcast?
Oh, I mean, I'm going to mark this one explicit because Anthony already said a couple swears, so you can swear.
So it happens to me a lot that I will have a burning passion for a game or a hobby or something that occupies an inordinate amount of my mental space, and then that'll last for a few months, and then kind of out of nowhere it's gone. And the analogy I was thinking is say you have I'm not going to go there. Okay.
I'm so curious. You have to tell us
we can always cut it out.
At the very
Okay.
least.
What I was thinking is that, say you have like an incognito window open for some reasons, like there comes a point where you have like no interest in what's on that window anymore, and it's not, it's just like a very sudden you're done with it. And
yeah, I feel like a lot of those, I definitely feel that experience related to hobbies where it sort of takes like a self-sustaining amount of enthusiasm, and it can really suddenly drop off that you realize, well, I've kind of maybe just been doing this out of habit, and that self-sustaining enthusiasm kind of falls apart very, very quickly.
Yeah, I find like for a lot of games that I have some kind of internal goal that I've defined. Like when I played StarCraft 2, I really wanted to make Masters rank, and then I made it, and I don't think I ever like played another ranked game of it after that. Like before that, I was watching professional games, I was taking notes, I was practicing in my free time, doing different drills to get better at it. And then like at the drop of a hat, I just was done. And I don't know what's happening in StarCraft 2 anymore. It is not like relevant to my life at all. I still think it's a good game. There are plenty of games that I think are incredibly designed and fun to play. I think it's just kind of like symptomatic of my personality, and my brother has it also, where we'll just be really into something for a while and then it's done. So I haven't been playing any Magic. I haven't been creating any content. I've got some footage I shot for a video that I haven't edited. I have Dom Harvey asking me when we're going to review the new Innistrad set, and that's not happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched the spoilers, and I think, I don't know, like Slogurk looks potentially interesting, but beyond that, I don't have like a lot to contribute to the discourse. Because a lot of the way that you introduced the topic was like about Magic and me being in and out of Magic, but I just wanted to say that it's not a Magic thing to me. It's just my hobbies in general tend to flow that way.
Well, I feel like a lot of people are going to resonate with that. I'm curious, like, what is your emotional experience of this? Is it that, like, you're on just kind of an outswing and you, like, are like, whatever, fine, I'll go do something else? Do you miss the game at all? Like, I feel like some people... Here's where I have felt this before in my past. Back before I played Cube, I played a lot of EDH, and I would get all excited about a new EDH deck, and I would spend, a week every night after work just, like, putting the list together, scouring Scryfall, looking for cards for it, trying to get the balance of everything just right. Then I would start acquiring the cards, and a couple weeks later, I'd have all the cards in, I would get the deck, and the first time I would play it, it would just kind of like fall flat. And I'd be like, this actually is not that much fun. And then there's just like weird, for me at least, it's just weird like guilt almost, or like I wasted all that time working on this thing, and like what am I even doing with myself in my life that I spent all this time working on this thing I don't even like anymore? Like, do you have any of that like weird reflective, was this thing even really important to me if I just like checked out all of a sudden and it's not important to me anymore? Like, do you have any of that at all, or you just perfectly emotionally healthy and mature and just like, no, I'm doing something else right now and that's fine and normal?
I think there's like a certain amount of guilt in a way, but for me it's like more directed towards my community and not towards myself. Like, I have this website where people discuss Cube and all these things, and it's pretty like self-sustaining at this point. But still, as like the owner of it, I feel some sort of like obligation to the community to be present at some capacity. Mm-hmm. But at the start of like Magic, it was like I had played some shoebox Magic in the US right before I moved to Belgium, and I kind of jumped into it when I moved here and was playing Draft. It was Scars of Mirrodin at the time, and playing Standard, and I put together a Standard deck, like a budget version of Cobblade that I was winning some locals with. And when the first rotation came, like my financial picture wasn't great because I was still like, I did it totally wrong, that I accumulated student debt in America and then I moved to Europe. Like, you should really do it the other way.
The worst possible thing. You should have switched that.
Yeah, I'll do it better next time. But
maybe if Fannie Mae can't find you in Belgium, just don't tell them you've moved.
I once tweeted that I moved and that I wasn't receiving like the alumni mail and calls from my university. It's kind of like I don't know, because before I moved, it was like pretty intense, and I was actually going to grad school at the same school, and they were still kind of like harassing me for support because I was an undergrad alum.
Right.
And I made some tweet to that.
You're like, no, I'm still extremely indebted to you. You don't understand.
Yeah. And I made some tweet to that effect, and I didn't even like tag the university or something. And within a day, I got a DM from them. They're like, well, if you would like, you can send us your updated contact info and we'll...
Big yikes.
So getting back to Magic, like I really didn't want to like keep up with the constant rotation of like standard constructed. And I dabbled with modern a little bit, and I got a bunch of the staples. I had a playset of Tarmogoyf and built like a 5-color aggro domain deck with that. Well, it was pretty capable. But what I quickly found out was that I didn't want to like keep playing with the same cards over and over. So I had this like expensive modern deck with the idea that, okay, I've bought into the format with staples that'll keep themselves. And I just didn't feel the urge to attend the tournaments anymore with the same deck over and over. So I ended up like loaning out the modern deck to friends to play in GPs and stuff like that. And then eventually found my way to Cube, which I think is the ultimate escape from all the rotation and stuff. Like if you have a Cube, you can leave it on a shelf and it'll be as fun to play 5 years from now as it is currently with no changes.
One of the reasons that I don't play Arena or any other kind of digital Magic is not just because I don't have as much fun doing it, but because I also know my like kind of obsessive nature and that I probably would play it a lot. And then I think it would be much more likely to generate that kind of burnout in me where it's like, now I just feel like I have to grind to Mythic every time a new set comes out. And is there really any joy left in it? Or am I just kind of doing it because that's what I do now, right? And so, but it's definitely part of what Cube is for me. And honestly, I feel like one of the things that's great about Cube is for the past, I don't know, 4-ish years, I haven't really had a period where I've been like off of Magic, but I've definitely had periods where I was like not excited about any one of my cubes or a specific cube project and just like started a new one and like got completely consumed by that. And, you know, like the updates to my like main Bun Magic cube really suffered last summer when I was working on the Degenerate Micro cube. You know, I went through when sets came out and kind of threw some cards in or whatever, but very like poorly thought out, wasn't on my mind. And I was really focused on that project. And nowadays, I barely think about the Degenerate Micro Cube. That's kind of off some shelf in my brain. I'll come back to it in the future. And so I definitely kind of cycle around. And the fact that Cube allows you to do that at whatever pace you want rather than like waiting for Standard to rotate. I saw a lot of people at the end of Eldraine's time in Standard just like, come on. I'm waiting for these cards to rotate. I'm tired of playing with and against Bone Crusher Giant. This is like so boring. And the idea that you still have that cycle when you're working on cubes or battle boxes or other sandbox formats, but it's at your own discretion. Whatever you're interested in is what you can pursue instead of being beholden to some larger system, I think is one of the great appeals of Cube.
Do you think that this process of like the per set ins and outs of like I'm dropping these cards, I'm adding these cards, is that needed like in the Cube world?
I don't think it's needed. I think that change does keep people engaged though. Like you're right. If you took a cube and stuck it on a shelf 5 years later, it would still be exactly as fun as it was when you put it on that shelf. They don't age in that sense. But I think for that 5 years, it wouldn't be the hobby of the person maintaining it if they never made a change, right? Even if the structure of the cube dictated that it's already kind of complete and there's no reason to add anything new with when new sets come out. I think every like person's relationship to their cube is like a kind of a little mini archive and story of their relationship to the game and like what they value about it and how they've changed over time and how they've evolved. And so you can put it on a shelf. I just think that if you're not making updates to your cube, you're probably not really that invested in it. Probably. I mean, there's probably some people out there that are just grinding and playing games with it. Maybe there are people that just, you know, we've talked about people before that want a cube just because they want to play a bunch of limited. I've never actually met anybody like that. Maybe they are out there somewhere where it's just like, I just want to draft. I don't care. I got my cube set up and I'm never going to change it ever again because all I want is somebody to draft every week without having to pay for new booster packs. But I think for most people, at least like listeners to this show, people that consume cube content, like a huge part of the appeal of it is not just playing it, obviously, but the like relationship of ongoing maintenance. And the fact that that tends to be with new sets, I think is kind of coincidental in a lot of cases. Like I know for me, I'll have percolating ideas where I'm like thinking of making changes. And then when a new set comes out and I add a couple cards from it, that's also when I'll make those changes that have been percolating for a while. But that's kind of just an incidental when you make changes kind of thing, I think.
I don't know, though. I think that there is a huge population of people that do have that experience with Cube, but they just aren't interested in being part of a Cube community, which is fine.
Right,
Like, they
maybe less visible to
they
me, for
maybe
sure.
play the Arena Cube and they just get into a Discord and play that pretty regularly, and it's not a cube. For them, it's not a design project. And same if you have a set cube that you pull out
Set
every
cubes are
couple of
very
months
much
and
like
things
that,
like
yeah.
that. So I think that there are those communities, but for them, it is specifically not a design project. So I think if you are interested in Cube, very much like EDH, I think that designing a cube is actually almost a distinct experience and distinct format than actually playing EDH or playing a cube. And for those people, the new cards are a new opportunity.
But how many EDH players just like have a precon forever and that's what they do? I feel like if you play any amount of EDH, you're going to build your own deck.
Right. But I just mean from like, what is the actual experience? I think designing an EDH deck is almost a different format and one that I enjoy a lot more
that's
than
very
this
fun.
separate format of playing EDH, which
But in
is fine
EDH, you
occasionally.
have the problem that other people are updating their decks. Like, it's an inherently competitive
Right.
environment.
Totally, yeah.
Whereas,
you can't
like,
put your EDH deck on a shelf for 5 years
So,
and
yeah,
get it out
Cube-
have it still be competitive.
So Cube definitely can have that slower update cycle, and if you want to just choose to say I'll update it every 3 sets or every year or not at all, like any degree of updates, any life cycle actually works. Whereas there are like harder restrictions on standard where you do really need to pay attention with the every new set and the life cycle of the format.
I guess what
Yeah.
I'm thinking of is more like, if we think of it like detached from Magic a little bit and like look at it as like a game design thing. I know games as a service are a thing now, but there are a lot of games out there that are just like done and complete, and any released Magic set is done and complete, and the goal was to like, for the designer presumably, to like get it as close to a state of perfection as they could. And I feel like the process of like always updating with new cards is certainly an enjoyable one, but it's not necessarily like aligned with that kind of pursuit of a fixed perfection that you see in some other areas of game design.
I totally agree, and I think it's worth saying because I think a lot of people do feel like, oh, every time I change my cube gets better. And it's like, no, your cube gets different, right? And better in the sense that maybe you better understand your own goals. Maybe you can better articulate what you're trying to get out of the game. Maybe you have a better evaluation of the cards and how they perform in your environment because more time has elapsed and you have a better understanding of what the powerful cards are, what the less powerful cards are. But it's just a different cube, right? Like, unless you have very clearly articulated goals, there is no objective better or worse that your cube could possibly be. And while I like where my cube is now more than I would like to play my cube from 4 years ago, some people will prefer the cube 4 years ago for sure. That had a lot of cards and archetypes people really like that I don't support anymore. At some of my play group, people still miss, honestly. And so I think it's important to recognize that, like, yeah, you're not making your cube better. You're not a game designer in pursuit of finishing something every time you update your cube. Your cube is just changing because you as a player are changing, your play group is changing, your goals when you sit down to play a game of Magic are changing. And it's, I think, beautiful that the cube can change with you, but I do think people would generally be benefited from abandoning this idea that they are making a step towards perfection with every edit.
I guess I do feel a bit regretful that, I don't know, that I didn't, like, 5 years ago when I was really into my cube, like, create some, like, finished product version of it. And a lot of that is that the way I maintain and do my cube is in a really weird way that's not really conducive to that. I guess the analogy I sometimes like to use for cube design is that you're like the lead designer for a game that doesn't exist, and all the cards in the Magic card pool are just kind of like design submissions by a group of like design interns that you have, and then you can kind of pick and choose what
a
you
group
like.
Of design interns named Mark Rosewater and the Magic R&D design team.
Exactly, but at a certain point, you're going to be like, I already have 20,000 cards. Stop sending me emails with another 150 cards in them. Let me like search through this to try to like get the product that I'm going to like put on a shelf for people to buy, because Magic, the game itself, is like in a lot of ways like compromised by the fact that it's run by a company that wants to like continually put out new product in a certain way. And so you're not going to have, one of the things that's been discussed in my community lately is that a lot of people are playing with customs that are like actually just better than alpha beta duels, and they're not breaking the game. It's not something that's like, ruining their cube. And there's always like an opportunity cost for actually picking a card in the draft and including it. But you're not going to see something strictly better than an alpha beta duel in Midnight Hunt just because of the ecosystem of how Magic works.
Right.
Regardless of whether that would make for a better standalone draft experience.
Yeah, if we take your analogy a step further and look at those 20+ thousand cards of submissions for designs for cards to be included in our individual games, a lot of those cards were not designed with even close to our goals in mind, right? Like you said, they're designed in this ecosystem where there's eternal formats, there's a reserve list, there's a for-profit company with its own capitalist goals that it has to meet in order to continue to exist, and that is not necessarily going to produce the best game pieces for people's individual cubes. So, yeah, I mean, I totally buy that cards that are alpha duels plus are actually probably fine. I mean, they're still going to be great and high picks, but depending on your cube goals, they are not going to be in a drafted singleton environment, the kind of thing that's going to completely warp and ruin the game necessarily.
I mean, yeah, ultimately, the thing that I always like to argue for is that the power level of Magic cards is pretty arbitrary. It's entirely arbitrary, and it only matters how these game pieces relate to each other. So when people get really excited about, wow, here's a new duel that's incredibly powerful, it's going to make this game so much better, I am just like, well, that level, that like goal of an alpha beta duel is the peak power level, and that's why I'm sharping out enters tapped on my snow duel
and getting 600 upvotes on Reddit.
Like, you could just do the same thing with a tri-land, but you don't see that as much because there's this like really resonant piece of nostalgia. But really, either of those is probably be fine, and people are always drafting from the same pod, and it makes sense in both directions. Just like the power level is arbitrary, we could keep going up, we could also keep going down.
Right, and you see that
too
with
being
like
arbitrary is entirely correct in a way. I mean, like, obviously, we could scale up all the damage and power and toughness by 10 or whatever, and it'd still be the same game. I do think something like the converted mana cost of your cards matters a lot in terms of...
Jason, I know you've been unplugged for a while, but we call it mana value now, so I'm going to have to go ahead and just hop in there and, actually you.
The MV of your cards. So if you have like a ton of really low MV cards in your hand, you're going to have like a lot more branching paths in how you play the game versus if you have like curve out 2, 3, 4, 5 in your hand, and that's the way that your curve is structured. Like I think from that perspective, the cost really is not like strictly a relative thing.
Yeah, I see where, Anthony, you're coming from with the everything is completely arbitrary, but I also don't think it is. Like, where individual cards fall, it's not arbitrary. It's a factor of one set of design considerations, which leads to fun gameplay, right? Look at the Pokemon trading card game, where they were like, the numbers don't matter. Let's just add 1,000 to all of them, which is basically how power toughness and all those sort of numbers worked in the Pokemon trading card game. And it was, I think, objectively worse from a game design perspective. Like, it's not arbitrary that the numbers were 1,000 times higher than they were in Magic, because when they're 1,000 times higher, it's way hard to see what's the biggest thing on the battlefield, and does this effect actually destroy this creature or whatever. So I think all of the decisions around mana value and all the costs and all the numbers and all the things in Magic are carefully considered, but a lot of those considerations, a lot of the things dictating those decisions are not, does this produce the most fun game? Because that is one of WotC's myriad of things they have to balance when they're making Magic cards.
Yeah, of course. Like, everything in the game matters relative to each other, and the way that those scale relative to each other. And the fact that Magic is this game of small numbers, and what that atomic unit of mana or other resources is, like, those things do matter. But at the same time, you know, recently Mark Rosewater was on Drive to Work. Sorry, he's often on Drive to Work. Recently,
frequent Drive to Work guest Mark Rosewater. I believe he's been the guest about 700 times at this point.
Richard Garfield was on Drive to Work recently with Mark Rosewater, and I thought it was really interesting that so many of the questions that Mark asked, Richard didn't really have a solid answer. It wasn't like, oh yeah, we did a lot of playtesting to figure out what the life total should be.
Was this the same episode where he was like trying and failing to remember the basic rules text of completely iconic Magic cards?
That could be, yeah.
Where he was like, Library of Alexandria doesn't tap for mana, right? And Mark's like, actually it does. And he's like, oh,
wild. I don't know why we did that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that some of the lands you still have produced mana, and some of them don't produce mana. How did you decide which ones produced mana and which ones didn't produce mana?
I would have to see them case by case. I'm sure that if they had, I'm sure the ones that didn't, I had a specific, I was trying to reflect that place as I saw it within the mythos that I was designing for. So easy is Library of Alexandria. Having that be not for mana, but having it be for cards is natural because it's a library.
It does tap for mana. So,
does it?
But it is interesting how, the life total kind of does, like when you're starting to set out the game from scratch, you could have set the life total in a lot of different places, and things were built around whatever that one number was.
Right, like the seed crystal may have been arbitrary.
Right.
But from whence everything grew, it grew by some procedure, right?
Right.
Some set of goals resulted in the ecosystem we have now.
So I have to ask, taking a step back, you mentioned that the way that you design and manage your cube isn't conducive to creating some kind of finished product. What do you mean by that?
I just mean, like, okay, so, well, there's a couple of things. I don't use Cube Cobra or the late Cube Tutor to manage my cube. Effectively, my cube is 360 slots, and each of these will like sample from a set of cards with some sort of sampling rarity. So maybe slot number 1 will be like Student of Warfare, it's locked in, and then slots 5 through 7 are a group of 6 other white 1-drops, and we'll select 3 of them every time I draft at random. What this allows me to do is kind of create a marriage between having the perfect structure I want, especially in terms of like the mana that's in my cube, while still giving me the variety benefits that you get from a larger cube. Whereas like a finished product would be if Wizards of the Coast would come to me and they would say, we need a 540 card cube or whatever for people to draft from on Magic Online. There are a lot of changes that I would have to make in terms of how that's set up. And I think one of the reasons that Cube can lead to a burnout or whatever you call it is because it is so labor intensive. And if I want to make an update to my cube and I'm running it on Magic Online, like I have to update my data file where I have everything. I need that to then run some other scripts that will update like an export of my list to Magic Online, and I have to go onto 2 different Magic Online accounts and make sure that they're both fully stocked with the cards that I need to play properly. And so it's really like when you have that like driving passion towards building your cube and updating it, and when it's on your mind all the time, it doesn't really feel like work. It's just kind of like a byproduct of the hobby. But then when you fall off of it a little bit, it's like I could not be bothered to do any of that at the moment.
You've built up a particularly impressive and complicated architecture around your cube. The idea that before you can play Cube, you have to run a bunch of scripts and update a data file and then update some Magic Online accounts, certainly I think is going to make it harder for you to just like on a whim be like, you know what, I feel like some Cube right now. And so I totally understand how that would lead to less incidental Cube playing happening.
Right.
Although it still seems totally reasonable for that to be a finished product. It's a less portable finished product because
it's
you
less
can't
communicable. Yeah, it's hard to be like, there it is, snapshot. It's like, well, you have to understand what all these things mean. Yeah.
I don't know. I always have kind of like a list of cards that I'd like to make room for and accommodate in certain ways. And a lot of that is driven by new cards coming out. And I feel like if I would be able to like mentally block all that out and like just focus on the 20,000 cards that I do have, that the design process would be different. And probably, like if you would think of like the design quality of your cube, probably it ebbs and flows as you make changes. And it's, as Andy was saying, not strict improvements as you make tweaks. So a lot of changes that I make kind of just take me into a different space rather than improving how happy I am within the space that I have. Whereas if I would be trying to build it differently for like a finished product, I would really focus on like tightening up the design as much as I could rather than toying with new ideas.
Yeah, and a great example of this, I think, is that a lot of people are excited when they get a clean, strict upgrade over a card in their cube, right? They're like, oh, finally, we have Play with Fire, which I can put in over Shock or whatever. And they think this is a clean, obvious upgrade. My cube is just a little better now. And we talked a lot about how power level does not relate to just good gameplay, but also the change that small decision, that small, seemingly strict upgrade makes on how the environment plays is this like slippery slope that I think a lot of cube designers are not conscious of, where they're like, I made this card slightly better. All right, what does that actually mean? Now the decks that want that card all got slightly better. Or if that card is a very flexible card that goes into every deck, now you have more strong, flexible open picks instead of committal open picks early on in the draft. That means that it changes the nature of how your drafters interact with actually drafting their deck and what they're more likely to end up playing. And there's all these like little things that are kind of knock-on effects of the decision to just, like, people don't, I think, understand that the change that has in the cube is not just that that's one less card people are going to be like bummed to see in a pack, right? Now people can be a little more excited to see this card because it's a little more powerful and your players are trying to win, so they care about the power level of the cards. It changes a lot of things, and then you look at that in the aggregate, then that just kind of shows you that everybody's just kind of forging a path, but it's not a path towards any objective improvement. It's just a path towards a different place, right? Everyone's just going a different place with their environment. That if you're excited about strict upgrades over cards on power level reasons, then you're just pushing your cube into a more powerful place. And if more powerful is more or less fun is completely subjective, obviously. Something related I wanted to talk to you about specifically, Jason, is, as I mentioned, I've been like a little bit less super enthusiastically engaged with Magic for the past couple months. Honestly, the best example of this is just that I haven't bought any cards since Modern Horizons spoiler season, basically, which is rare for me. Usually I'm kind of a constant little trickle of cards coming in. Honestly, part of it, the mail in Baltimore is so incredibly fucked up right now. I'm not getting half the mail that's sent to my house, and it's hugely annoying, and a lot of things were lost in the mail this past like summer. And so I'm just like off ordering things online because I don't want to have to worry about like chasing stuff down if it doesn't show up. But also, I've been a little less engaged, and I've been spending a little bit more time thinking about bikes, which is an old hobby and passion of mine. I say old in that it was a hobby and passion of mine 10 years ago. And then 10 years ago, I kind of fell off the bike as a hobby wagon. I had my bike that I rode every day to work, and, you know, I cared about that, but I didn't care about thinking about bikes, talking about bikes. It was a very practical thing for me. It was not unlike the cube you put on a shelf for 5 years, right? I had it as part of my life, but I wasn't taking up any of my free brain space. It wasn't a hobby. And I got back into it a little bit. I've been watching a couple YouTube channels and like getting caught up on the bike world. And there's this one YouTube channel. It's called A Path Less Pedaled. And he has a video talking about bike burnout, which is funny because it's like a hobby thing. It's not unlike us talking about Magic burnout. And he specifically was talking about how in the bike world, especially if you like look at bike content creation, and it's so silly to me that every single thing that exists now we have a content creation sphere about, but it's true, right? There's a whole bike content creation universe out there. Mm-hmm. And he was basically saying that in that world, there's really just like competitive cyclists, right? Like what's the lightest bike? What's the fastest bike? What's the newest, most expensive bike stuff? Who's setting records in races and stuff like that? And there was not really much space for anything else. That's all that like the bike journalism world, the bike content world could like produce, was just this like focus on optimizing cycling, right? And I could not help but think that there's so much in the Magic world and the Cube world that is just about optimizing Magic and optimizing your Cube from a power level perspective, right? We talk about the most powerful card that comes out, but we don't talk about the most interesting, cool card or the card that slots into the most archetypes or the card that's most flexible. We just talk about the most powerful cards because that's the easiest thing to focus on. It's the easiest thing to choose as a community that we're all going to sort of center around. Right. And he got really burned out on this. And so he like has built a little following for himself and built up this, what he calls Party Pace, is like his little like brand name thing. He has stickers and stuff for it. But it's around people that are extremely invested in cycling. Bikes are their hobby. They want to build bikes. They want to think about bikes. They want to watch videos about bikes. They want to ride them all the time. But they don't care about optimizing these other things. And I feel like he filled a niche in the bike world that I feel like I would love for someone, maybe us, to help fill in the Magic world, which is people that are not casual. I mean, like, that's the thing. In Magic, we have competitive, we have casual. Those are the two spectrums. Either you're extremely invested, you're optimizing everything, you're like, you know, blinging out your EDH deck, or you're a casual, you don't really play Magic that much. You don't really, you know, you play every once in a while. You go to F&M, you know, once a month, or maybe you go to pre-releases. Right. And this like slot of people that care a lot about this thing, it brings a lot of joy to them, but they don't care to optimize the crap out of it, is the particular section of Magic as a hobby that I am interested in like speaking to. And I don't know if that resonates at all with you and your experience playing Magic and making Magic content for your entire career.
Yeah, I mean, the start of Riptide Lab was basically, I had, when I started writing for Channel Fireball, I guess my first article was basically the concept that a card that's good in your cube isn't necessarily good for your cube, kind of connecting to the rant that you were going on about yeah, it's better from a power level perspective, but is it better design? And this is always like a tricky thing, because when you shift the conversation that way, like there's no objective metric for how good a design is. And you can have multiple people who are very talented designers come to completely opposite opinions on something like that. Whereas something like power level is easier to get some sort of objective consensus on, even though
you at least know what you're arguing about with power level.
Yeah.
Like, you might not agree, but you can agree on what the thing you disagree on is, which I think is what we're missing from any other kind of discourse about Magic.
Yeah, so a lot of people were coming to me trying to find some space where they could talk about cube design without the kind of subtext of maximizing power. And that's what Riptide Lab was born from. And I mean, like any space, there's groupthink that develops over time, and there's certainly, I like to think of it as a very open-minded place, but I think they're sometimes like aggressively closed-minded towards some of the more mainstream implementations of Cube. And so I'm not exactly sure what the answer is in terms of defining that space that you were talking about, but I do think Cube as a hobby is very conducive to that in terms of we don't have to optimize things along a certain axis. And I think over time, people have become more and more receptive to that. And certainly with your Cube Map project, you guys have seen that there's an ever increasing diversity among cube designs, which I think is a good thing.
I actually had no idea that was the origin story of Riptide Labs. So you were writing for Channel Fireball first, and that generated some interest in extended discourse, and you were like, well, I'll make a place for that to happen, I suppose.
Yeah, at first it was actually just like a Google group back when those things existed, and then we kind of outgrew that. And
they still exist. They're just not used anymore that way.
Oh. Well, eventually we had to kind of make a website out of it, and that's where it's at now. It hasn't really changed a lot since we started it. We updated the forum software recently, but beyond that, it's kind of what you would have seen back in 2013.
Which is very charming, I think, personally. As someone who has a soft spot for when the internet was like a cool, promising thing, as opposed to an advertising tube that just spat misinformation at you with a bunch of Amazon affiliate links in it, I find the old school aesthetic a little bit charming.
I figured out what I was going to say to your previous rant. When you're like designing a cube, it's kind of like bowling with bumpers, and that, you know, Magic as a game already exists, and if you're not using custom cards, then all these cards have been kind of vetted by a R&D process already. So even if you are making these subtle replacements and things that maybe aren't ideal in terms of the balance of your cube or something, like, you're pretty protected in that the people who are going to show up to play your game already like Magic, and there's like a huge novelty factor to Cube if you're used to only drafting retail strength sets. And so I think it's hard for people not to have a good time with it.
I love that metaphor. I mean, it's such an interesting space that Cube offers, where it is in a lot of ways kind of like doing game design. But yeah, like you're saying, you have that safety net that you're working within a system that has already had a lot of the kinks worked out.
I will say, though, like almost every time I've played a MTGO cube, I've just been fucking miserable. Like...
So is that in the metaphor, is that too many bumpers? Like, you know, it's just nothing but bumper when you roll the ball down? Or
well, I've become very like opinionated about the type of Magic that I like to play. Like, it's pretty low curve, very interactive. And I played the Bant Cube with a member of our community a while back, and there was like next to no interaction in the cube. So like you just had like very little agency as a player, and permanents would pile up on each side of the board. Generally, I like gameplay that is like pretty light on like onboard permanents, and it was like I didn't feel a lot of control in the matches, and then games would just kind of slowly slip away with you because you couldn't interact with your opponent's permanents very much, and if they had more snowbally permanents than you did, then you just kind of saw the game slowly rolling out of your control. It just gave me a pretty like miserable feeling the whole time.
And then you stop playing Magic for 6 months.
Yeah, pretty much.
I don't want to sound too negative by this, but do you think that a lot of that comes from just like a very different taste in a lot of players that have come to the game through Commander specifically, where it's much less about like the complex, really nuanced, spiky gameplay and more about what kind of deck can I build and what kind of machinery can I get
complex,
working?
nuanced deck, but
Right.
it's about like you come to the table with a very specific plan. You want to do your thing and see how it stacks up with other people's things, and it's less about this zero-sum, tight affordance game of permanents in play and life totals and just trying to eke out a win.
So back when I played Hearthstone, they have like these modes that come out every week called a Tavern Brawl. They're just like limited time things. They're open for like 3 days, and if you win a game in it, you get a pack, and just kind of something to keep the player base engaged. And I think I was like most people. I would play 1 or 2 games of it when it came out. I would get my pack and then kind of forget about it. And I know there were people that really like kept track of which ones they thought were the best tavern brawls and which ones they thought were good and bad and what was nice about them and not. But to most people, they didn't care. It was just kind of like a diversion from the regular grind. And I think to most the player base, that's what Cube is. Like, maybe it's not the best design, limited time format. Maybe there's like things that could be better about it, but it's very different from what they're doing already. It can fill an afternoon and then they move on with their life. So I feel like I'm one of those like weirdos on Reddit that's like, no, this Tavern Brawl was way better. They should do more like this, when really they're just trying to, I don't know, Diablo 3 came out, so they're making a limited time Diablo 3 mode in Hearthstone, and that's all it's there for. So I think the demands of people who are approaching Cube as like their full-time Magic hobby can be different. And beyond that, I know Andy is a Smash player, and I've been very like involved
Generous
in the Melee
label.
scene in the past. And even among people who play a lot of Smash, there's, you know, people want different things out of it. I tend towards like the very competitive side of it, but there's nothing wrong with the people who want to play something looser, like channel Emrakul for a game and enjoy that. Like, to me, that's the items on like equivalent of cubing, and you can't really say objectively that one is better or worse. I certainly have my preference among them, but I don't think that I'm the target audience for a Wizards of the Coast cube.
Yeah, I mean, this distinction makes a lot of sense, and I think from that perspective, it really highlights actually how I think a lot of the Magic Online cubes are really successful, because they're not about, you know, let's get back in the grind, let's have the same kind of gameplay for people that are cubing once a week, twice a week. They're designed for people that are playing other formats and are looking to try something a little bit different. And I feel like the question is always like, what can I do in this cube? And so they want to design cubes where players have something they can do. You know, they
need a log line, something to sell
They
it.
can live the dream, or they can, you know, lean into what these particular colors are about, or proliferate a huge board. Those feel like more unique accomplishments than just, I used my removal spell at just the right time, or I knew the right card to discard for my opponent.
So I have a son that just turned 1, and probably one of the contributing factors to me burning out a bit was that at some point he started crawling, which made him much more of an energy drain than when he was kind of in the dormant potato phase of his life.
And you couldn't keep sorting your cards on the floor because you couldn't
exactly.
get to them now.
Excuse me, Jason has a bunch of scripts to sort his cards automatically on his computer. I don't think there's many cards piled up on the floor.
I do have like the remnants of my physical cube still around the house, and we use that to kind of like battle box with the wife and I, but it's been a long time since I had an actual cube night in paper.
I'm glad you brought up Smash, because there's something I want to talk to you about, and it's not actually...
We could just do an episode about Smash.
Well, so no, here's my thing. Have you been following the Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl scene, Jason?
I saw Leffen stream it for about 10 minutes where he was going over the mechanics of it.
Anthony, is it safe for me to assume you have absolutely no idea what Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl is at all?
None whatsoever.
Okay. So this is interesting to me because for your benefit, Anthony, for the benefit of the listeners that are not up on the latest Smash scene stuff, Smash Brothers, the original 64 version came out, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and there's been a bunch of iterations since then, and it has spawned a series of like knockoffy or heavily inspired games that are also percent-based platform fighters where you're trying to get someone off the screen to kill them instead of getting their HP to 0. And there's been a bunch of these, and the latest iteration of this is a game sponsored by Nickelodeon called Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl. It is basically Smash Brothers, but with Nickelodeon characters. But importantly, a lot of the developers of this game were very invested in Smash Brothers Melee, which, according to many Smash players, I think Jason among them, would argue that is like the apotheosis of competitive Smash is Smash Melee. Just the way the mechanics of that game happened to work out, it was like perfectly tailored to a really, really deep skill level, really high skill ceiling, a lot of investment, and very like skillful expression in fighting gameplay. And so the Smash World got very excited about Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl because for as much as they like the new Smash game well enough, it does have much more approachable mechanics and they've actually effectively tried to weed out some of these more complicated movement mechanics that people really liked in the competitive scene in Melee in the later games because it was just adding this depth and complexity that most people didn't care about and it was like messing stuff up. So people were really excited about this game, and a couple people, most noticeably HBox, has been just obsessed with this game, watching every single spoiler video. Eventually got sponsored by Nickelodeon to get a preview copy and play a bunch of games on his YouTube channel. And it strikes me, I have not played this game. I won't play this game, I'll tell you right now. I like Smash well enough. I'm not a very good player. I don't play very often, frankly. I honestly probably watch Smash content more than I actually play Smash. I just think it's a brilliant game and really well designed, and I'd love to watch people that are really good at it. But I've watched a couple of people play competitive. It's like the game hasn't even been released yet. I think maybe it comes out today. I've watched people play theoretically high-level Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl with all of these mechanics that they theoretically really wanted, right? These are things people that love Melee or love Project M have been talking about for years, is bringing back wave dashing and all this kind of crap. And every time I watch these videos of HBox or MKLeo or Leffen or whoever playing Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, they are having no fun. They're just sitting there dead-faced, playing the game. Watching it is not, maybe I haven't developed an eye for it yet, but watching it is not fun. It's too manic. I can't tell what's going on. It seems like shielding is not even a thing. It's not fun to watch. It doesn't seem like it's fun to play, and I can't help but feel like my very early prediction, we're recording this on Wednesday, October 6th, before this game is even widely available or people have opinions about it. Just based on the videos I've seen, I feel like this is going to fall flat, and it's going to be a case of people thought they wanted this thing. They thought they understood what was fun and interesting about Melee, and they were so excited to see those mechanics brought back in a new game with modern netcode and on modern platforms. And ultimately, it's going to be a case of people misidentifying what was actually fun about the core thing.
Well, there's been a long history of people trying to make Melee-inspired platform fighters that have fallen flat. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if this fell flat.
Though a lot of those I think have fallen flat either because they've come under legal action from Nintendo or because they were made by independent developers that didn't have access to major platforms and a bunch of money. This is Nickelodeon. It's sponsored this thing. It's theoretically a decent amount of money behind it. So I think that in theory it could become successful, right? I don't think it will, but I think it's because the actual gameplay does not look very fun based on what I've seen.
Yeah, I think there's a big gap between the taste that you have for something and the ability to necessarily recreate something that has that essence. I know,
Absolutely.
What was it called? There was some platform fighter that was promoted for a while a few years ago that was basically dead on arrival called something Arena, and it was one of the lead designers on it was a former colleague of mine back when I worked at Major League Gaming. And so I kind of wanted it to succeed, but it never got off the ground. And I think Melee is in some ways like some sort of beautiful accident, but it also has the polish of a actual Nintendo product that none of these other games will have. And I think as much as people want to focus on the mechanics, that there is something about the polish that matters. And there's a reason why, even though it doesn't interest me that much that a picture of cube storage will get 1,000 upvotes on Reddit and people will post pictures of their new foil from whatever set, is that people care a lot about the polish of a game and they have a lot of emotional connection to how the art or the animation or the sound effects and all these things are done in a way that I think is hard to even consciously recognize and certainly isn't always talked about much amongst people who are like hardcore into the competitive angle of something.
To put it another way, I feel like the aspects that people think they like from Melee, like wave dashing and shines and stuff like that, these like mechanics that, you know, emerge from that gameplay are like, that's the arbitrary stuff, the same way that like Black Lotus is an arbitrary powerful magic card. They just happened to be the thing they decided to make powerful, right? Like, that's not what makes Melee great. What makes Melee great is like the underlying philosophy and the, like you said, kind of the incidental confluence of like just a lot of things lining up. And it was kind of, like you said, a little bit of a beautiful accident. It was meant to be this party game, but they happened to make this game that also has this really, really deep skill pool that you can go be extremely committed to and get a lot of reward for your investment. And I think that people trying to recreate that are like people trying to recreate Magic by saying, all right, well, let's start. We need Black Lotus, obviously, and we need like, you know, the Moxie. We need these iconic things that everyone loves. And it's like, that's not what's great about Magic, right? What's great about Magic is this underlying philosophy, the same way that, like, I do think that like seed crystal metaphor is strong for me, where it's like, you have this seed crystal, it grows in some pattern. You take that same seed crystal, it'll grow in different patterns every time, slightly different patterns within this like boundary, and you look at the one growth and you're like, there it is. That's the good thing. And it's really just incidental.
Or I think maybe even a cleaner example is they'll take Magic and say, well, players don't like variance. They don't like losing to mana screws. So let's, fix that in a dramatic way. Let's just remove that. But yeah, I think that the fact that we as players or consumers don't actually have a good handle on what makes a thing fun for us. Like the example I've gone back to is Arena itself. If you had asked me before Arena came out, do you want to be able to play Magic digitally? I would say, yes, absolutely. That would be great. But in reality, it's just like I wasn't aware of what it was about Magic that I really enjoyed and why that didn't hit in the way I expected.
You were like, faster horse, faster horse, faster horse, faster horse.
I think I maybe talked about this with you, Anthony, once, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it was with another guest entirely, but on one of my podcasts, I was talking about how I, as a player, like, secretly hope that my opponent gets mana screwed and just plays nothing for the entire match. And I think there's something like, as much as we complain about the games where we got mana screwed or these sorts of things, that people do like
to win,
getting free victories, like easy victories, and probably something that can become very like unsatisfying on like online games. So I played a game called Apex Legends for a while, and they kind of do something with their matchmaking where like if you've like kind of been doing badly for like 3 or 4 games in a row, they'll throw you into like a ridiculously easy lobby just to like give you that feeling of like easily dominating again.
Wow.
And I think and obviously you can't give it to everybody all the time. Like, there's a total population that you have to take into account, but they've kind of like Skinner boxed it in this way for player retention that they know everyone wants an easy win every now and then. And I think that's kind of like baked into Magic that people who play a lot see as a downside.
It's really interesting because like, obviously for every person that's paired down into a lobby with a bunch of less experienced players, they're the person that, their opponent got mana screwed because their opponent got paired up. They have one person in their lobby that's like way better than everyone else. That is actually, I think, it is also zero sum the same way that mana screw is zero sum, right?
But the easy one every once in a while, I can imagine, is so much more visible than the hard one every once in a while because, yeah, you're losing some chunk of your games. And if one of them happened to be harder, you maybe didn't even notice that at all. You didn't know that the more experienced players there.
Yeah, you could just write it off to some other invisible
which I feel like is really important to all the, not my opponent did literally nothing, which I'm not going to judge you if you enjoy that every once in a while. But there's all that space in between where, yeah, the better player could have won this, but because they drew one too many lands, you got the edge on them. And that variance, I think, does create a lot of what is satisfying about the game. And there are also those moments where you decide to, keep the risky mulligan and you draw just what you need. And that's actually so much more rewarding than if you just knew exactly what cards you were going to get.
And it's so important, too, that variance is largely hidden information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, aside from the extreme versions where opponents like, look, it's turn 9 and I have 1 land in play, like, you don't see the drew 1 too few removal spells, drew 1 too many threats, or, didn't have that 4th land of the second color right when they needed it or whatever, because that's invisible to you. You don't have the hidden information of their hand. And so you get to feel like it was your skill a lot of the time that gets you across the finish line. And that's, of course, not to say that Magic is not a game of skill. It absolutely is, but it's also in equal parts, if not more so, a game of variance. And that is a big part of what makes it fun.
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel totally miserable dying to 7 hits of True Name Nemesis, but I'm not going to notice if I lost to, like, Brainstorm on turn 3 or whatever that sculpted their hand better. And
drew them the True Name Nemesis.
Why do you guys not play Slay the Spire?
Honestly, I don't have any time or space in my emotional or physical life for more games. I've heard of this game. I've never actually even played it. And I don't even know what it is, but I've heard people like it.
I don't have a good reason. I'm really just not that into games. Is that a weird thing to say? I'm really not a game player. I'm just a Magic player. And there's sort of this activation energy that you have to put into playing a new game that you get to that point where you're like, now I really feel like I'm making strategic decisions and I'm involved in the community and whatever, that it just doesn't, I don't have that much motivation to start over with a new game.
Slay the Spire is a card game designed in such a way, it's a single player roguelike, so that means like you have a run that lasts like 1 to 2 hours and you can die along the way and your death resets you back to 0. It is designed in a way to be endlessly replayable for like 10,000 hours or however much you want to sink into it, and it is the best implementation of overlapping archetype design of any card game I've ever seen. There's 4 characters in the game, and each one is kind of like designed as its own little cube. Like there's different mechanics for each one, and they overlap in these interesting ways. And the more you play, like when I started playing the game, it kind of gave me the feeling as if I was like inventing these strategies that I would later kind of learn were much more common than I thought they would be. But it really gives the player the feeling of being incredibly clever in that the potential of your character slowly unfolds through like interlocking synergies. And the more you play, the more like subtle, incredible synergy you see between the card pool. And I feel like the design approach of that game is like everything that we should be doing for our cubes.
It's hard to argue with that.
Well, you could just say that Jason subjectively likes this game, but there's nothing objectively good about it because perfection is all a lie and it's impossible to achieve.
You could say that.
Well, it's one of those games like Smash where it is kind of spawning its own genre. And you saw this with Dominion also, and arguably Slay the Spire is based off Dominion. And I think every once in a while there come along these games that are like such a high watermark in terms of design that they invent a new genre around themselves.
Like Magic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of those games where if you have like critical thinking skills from Magic that should translate into an ability to play it well. That said, talking to people in my community, they tend to be incredibly poor at the game. So I don't...
Wow, real smack talk.
You hear that out there, Riptide Lab users? You got dragged.
Well, it is kind of like, though, I hear.
It could be that like everyone on my website, except for like Dom Harvey and Kerblinks, who have both won like super huge tournaments, are just terrible Magic players, and there's no way to like, in Cube, like we don't really play each other's cubes. We have like very strong opinions about what we like and don't like in Magic, and we'll judge other people's designs accordingly. But there's there's not a lot of like putting your foot to the fire with the people you're talking to. Like if you and I are building a standard deck and we have a strong disagreement about which deck is any good, we can just go to tournaments and answer that question. But I don't know, there are people on my website who feel very strongly in some way about too much fixing is not good for a cube environment. And I don't know if they've tested those ideas. I don't know if that's like a personal thing, or maybe if they would go out and play a cube that is the type of thing that they criticize, that they would love it. Or it could be like me, where I just feel miserable playing it, and it could just be a completely subjective thing. But it's kind of like indicative of like we don't have a very good mechanism to like test each other's ideas very well in the cube world.
No. And I think that ultimately is why we end up arguing about things like power level most of all, because that is one of the only things you can maybe begin to at least test or have some reckoning of, right? But beyond that, it's like, yeah, I mean, how do we test whether or not adding more fixing creates more interesting draft decisions and game decisions? Well, first let's define interesting decision, and then let's, start unpacking all of this like tiered nested complexity in how these decisions make those things happen. And
that's just not what people are there for the most part.
Yeah. And so it just reminds me that I think one thing I always try and tell people that I see them pop up if they're new to the community or they're new on Reddit or something, if they're asking for feedback on their cube, is I'm like, if you ask for feedback on your cube from other cube designers, you are mostly, for the vast majority, just going to get responses that are, make your cube more like mine. My cube is good, right? Unless
I think mostly you're going to get no feedback if I've looked at MTG Cube correctly.
I think people are pretty keen to give feedback.
Once the ball gets rolling.
There are so many like first cube, can you give me some feedback threads that pop up every day.
Like that,
yeah, there's a lot of those
replies.
that are really low effort, and I think because they're low effort, people give a commensurate low effort in their lack of reply. But yeah, it's like, because we don't have any solid ground on which to stand, it becomes very hard to truly dissect anyone's arguments when their argument is just like, this thing is good and fun. It's like, okay, great. I can't prove you wrong, right? And you can't prove yourself right. And so we're just going to basically have this intractable argument. I will say, maybe to like cap this conversation off, that I kind of think that intractability, though, is a huge part of what makes talking about Cube fun, if not the majority of it. If any of this was solvable, right? If fun was an objective thing, if we all agreed on what an interesting decision was and how many of them we wanted in our draft environments, we would have just solved this thing a while ago. And set reviews would just be, here are the things that are obviously good based on these objective criteria we've laid out.
To be fair, that's how most cube set reviews are.
They're written as if they are that, but they are definitely, most certainly not that. But yeah, I think that is why it's fun to talk about, because no one really knows what they're talking about, right? We're all just kind of reckoning. We're reckoning in the void.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, that really is what is interesting about Cube. And I've been thinking a lot about sort of my relationship, especially to Limited recently, where we had talked a while ago about like, is 17 lands just going to solve Limited? And it's like going to take out all the interesting decision making because all the data is just right there. And I was pretty confident when we had that conversation last time that no, absolutely not. Like, Limited is so complicated. It's never going to get to that point. Like, this data is just going to be another tool. But as I've seen it grow even more, and like everybody cites 17 lands, and we have, here's the deck breakdown, here's all the like card rankings, like solving that problem was interesting. But when the problem is actually solved, I just kind of don't see a lot of value in it for me anymore. Like, and if I'm going and going to play Limited and I'm competing against people who have been willing to sort of do this like not creative problem solving work, but they've just done they've done the net decking of Limited, there's just very little to that format to me. And that actually ties into a bunch of stuff that we brought out. Both of you've mentioned feeling this guilt, Jason, about not being as present with your community, and also, about this quality of players, where I've always felt, for as long as I've been interested in Magic, like, I want to be part of this community, but there is this objective measure of a player, right? Like, your skill can, to a degree, be measured. And so it's, I think, implicitly always been present to me that to be a better member of the community, you have to be a better player. You have to like optimize yourself, just like you were talking about, Andy, with these like bike people. And in the past couple months, especially, certain changes and maybe some certain Limited podcasts that just sort of like really kind of shook me up and made me start thinking about this. It's like, that actually doesn't matter at all. To be a contributing and interesting member of the Cube community, and definitely the Magic community broadly, I think that it is destructive that for many of us, I think we associate that connection, that the only way you can be contributing well is if you are an extremely proficient player. And that kind of makes me feel a little bit about, do we tie too much of our identity with our hobbies?
You really got there, huh?
Yeah, I'm taking it all the way. But when you're saying like, I feel guilt about not participating as much, I don't know if that's healthy. And I think that maybe we're over-investing ourselves in things where we should treat them just, for what they are worth and put value into them where we're gonna get value out of them.
Onion headline: Man with Magic the Gathering podcast thinks maybe he shouldn't make his entire identity about Magic the Gathering. No, you heard it here first, folks. Limited is canceled. We all unsubscribed from and 17 Lands has killed it, so Limited's over. Had a good run.
You make some good points. It would not surprise me if both Richard Garfield and Mark Rosewater were just abominable Magic players. And
I think Mark has said a couple of times he is awful, so I'm not surprised by him being a totally mediocre Magic player.
I wanted to ask you guys a kind of open-ended question about like what assumptions, because Cube kind of inherits a lot of stuff from Magic as a whole, and one of the things that I think I had assumed in the past is that drafting should always be a multiplayer thing. And during the pandemic, I wrote a online application for doing solo drafting in the way that Hearthstone is drafted, and I've had so much fun playing those decks. And to me, it didn't matter at all that I had drafted it single player. I know certain parts of the community are questioning the size of the cube or how many cards should be drafted per player. What other things could we question that are not being questioned?
So to answer your question really specifically, I think that draft can kind of be two very different things. One is a multiplayer game. And to me, when I think about designing my cube and when I sit down to play Cube, there are two separate games. There's the draft where I'm trying to evaluate what are the other people doing at the table, what signals am I picking up so I can draft a better deck. And that's half the experience in terms of how much fun I'm getting out of it. But there is that other half where you're just playing the games, so you can just think, well, the draft is just a mechanism to get a deck that has some variations such that you're not just playing the same constructed deck over and over again. So I think that if you're largely interested in that second half where you don't have a group of people to do a full 4 or 8 person draft, it's totally reasonable to come up with other mechanisms to add that sort of variation to your games of Magic, and also potentially to create this other interesting puzzle.
Yeah, that's a very good, thorough answer. And I mean, TLDR, just because the single player draft doesn't have all of the facets of a multiplayer draft doesn't make it any less fun or valid. It's just a different thing. I know a lot of cube designers that do single player drafts, or 2 people will draft 8 seats or whatever. I know both Jet and Parker do this with their own cubes. A lot of people do this because they don't have access to a all the time play group or people that are willing to draft the cubes online. And I don't just see it as a stopgap, this is only because it's less than drafting with 8 people. I think it's perfectly valid, and it's fun to look at a pack and look at a deck you've drafted and figure out what pick is the right pick, and then do that for a bunch of different decks all at the same time. I honestly one of my biggest motivations in making Cube content, as it were, is that I find this format immensely satisfying. It's the most gratifying way to play Magic to me, and there are so many perceived barriers to playing it, both power level, budget, not having 8 friends, not having this many cards, not being able to afford sleeves for it. There's just so many things people think Cube has to be that keeps them from playing Magic in the way that I think is the most gratifying and the most fun and the most satisfying way to do it. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think drafting with 2 people can be great, even if you're drafting 10 seats. I think drafting 1 person can be great. Draft a full table of decks yourself, play both sides of the table yourself. I think it's all perfectly valid Magic. I said TLDR, then my answer was longer and less coherent than yours, Anthony. If that's not a good summary of what this podcast is, I don't know what is.
Agreed.
So I think both of you, the degenerate microcube and what was yours, Anthony? The turbo cube or something?
What was your one weird cube, Anthony?
I'm responsible for the turbo cube, yes.
Yeah, both of those fundamentally question what it is to be like a cube and what are the parameters of that. And I think that over time it would be interesting to see people like push on the barriers in more ways. And I know when I started, I guess this is me like plugging my own work a little bit, that
Do
like
it.
for 2-player drafting, there was like Winchester and Winston drafting, and both of these were made by like very prominent designers. I had this written down once for a video. I don't want to say the names now, but I think one of them was like either Mark Rosewater or Aaron Forsyth, and then the other one is that like famous Magic player who like Gabriel Nassif, the one with the hat.
Yes, the one with the hat. That's him.
Yeah, I found both of these formats pretty terrible, and I'm gonna like break down from a mathematical perspective a bit why I found it that way. So they were both like based on the concept that each player brings 3 booster packs to the table, which is kind of like bound to 1, using actual like retail product to like push product, and 2, like keeping the same amount of cards as you would use in a booster draft, but just for 2 people. And if you think about the math of, say, a 360 card cube, you have like 50 of each monocolor section generally, and then 110 other cards spread out across like multicolor and artifact and lands. And if we look at like that cross section of, you have 50 cards of each monocolor, and let's round it up for math's sake to 52 of each, and then divide the cube by 4 into like a 90 card sample of it. Then you have like 13 monocolor cards of each color to divide among 2 players. And I did some simulations where you would assume that the players were working cooperatively. So let's say that one player is wanting the blue and black cards, and the other one is wanting the red and green cards, and no one wants the white cards because EDH players say they're bad. And then you try to like cooperatively end up with like each player having the highest percentage of their color of cards. You kind of cap out around like 75-80% with those drafting formats. And if you like convert that into a number, that's like usually like around, I don't know, like a 9-4 breakdown for each monocolor section. So more or less like your decks would be, let's say you end up with like 9 black cards, 9 blue cards, and then like, I don't know, 4 or 5 of each of the other colors. Like you're forced into like a 2-color splash deck and playing almost all the cards from all those colors. So there's not really much. You run into what I would call like the Goblin Guide Pyroclasm problem, where, okay, you have like all these cards that are castable with the same mana, but they don't really want to be in the same deck at all. And you end up with kind of like a gross pile of cards. And I don't think it's a coincidence. If you look at like the old Winston drafting article on wizards.com, they use Mirrodin as an example, just because like half the set is artifacts, so it doesn't really show immediately that you have this color problem going on. This was like a couple of things that like you see so little of the cube, and that if you constrain yourself to drafting 90 cards, that you are probably just going to end up with like garbage piles as decks.
Yeah,
And
I think to me the key thing that you said in there was that you're forced to play all of the cards of a color, and that's where you're actually eliminating a lot of decision space. And it's just sort of like, it's not just that my deck is underpowered, it's that I didn't get to make any decisions in building my deck.
Right. And so I was kind of like sitting with those problems in my head and trying to find an answer to them, and that's how I came up with grid drafting. And then even further, we started doing a lot of testing of grid drafting with like a 4-color card pool to kind of, a lot of times when I grid drafted and it would be 2-player with 5 colors, like you would not overlap too much in the cards that you wanted, which is kind of fine because grid drafting has the hate drafting baked in. But I don't know if like 5 colors is even like optimal, especially for like a 2-player game. I feel like it kind of spreads your card pool pretty thin. And you can see that if you if you go to say like a Pokemon TCG tournament, there they have, I don't know, like 11, 13 colors of energy. And so you can't like draft it in any reasonable way because you're not going to get a functional deck. So if you go to a pre-release, they just give you like 90% of a deck and 3 packs that you can like fill in. But everybody's deck is almost entirely just like the preset that they hand you with like 2 to 5 splash cards in there. And so I feel like most cubes are color balanced and these sorts of things, but I don't know if that's if there are even good design benefits to it. I know some people run color imbalanced things, and I wish I had time to explore all these kind of design constraints that we take for granted and push against them and see what shakes out of that.
Yeah, I totally agree that there is so much, especially in the constraints and the why that we do things, especially when we talk about really concrete things like that Magic was for the longest time played with certain pack sizes, because not even because that was a design choice, but because the game was designed
that was
with
a printing choice.
The printing choice, but that was
Pack collation
inherited
choice.
from the fact that it was the same machinery that was printing packs of baseball cards that then they co-opted to make a game out of. So there's so many of these assumptions which...
Why were baseball card packs that big? Is it because of how big a baseball team is? Is that who we have to thank for the size of our default assumed pack size?
That's
I'm the
not
wrong
the size
person to
of a
ask.
baseball team.
Thanks for being the real American here.
I'm a big sportsman.
So yeah, I totally agree that there are so many of these decisions that even though those were in a lot of ways those same kind of seed crystals that a lot of the game has been built around, so they do work well, we can still question them.
But like a retail pack for a lot of Magic's history contained a basic land, and so it was functionally like a 14 card pack, and people started cubing naturally with 15 card packs, and yet and nobody really opposed to that. But then you'll see someone...
I play with 14 cards in a basic land in each cube pack. Isn't that what everyone does?
You can do it. But you see, like, you know, some things are perfectly accepted, and then, I don't know, someone can come along and say, I think it should be like 21 card packs or whatever, and you'll see people push back against the idea without really having like a strong reason other than like the underlying history of it and it being new and a bit like uncomfortable. But I don't feel like if I see these arguments online against certain changes that they're really like based in anything.
No, 21 is just too many cards. We can all agree that one's based in just the fact that that's just too many cards to look at and read.
Sure, that's an argument, but there's people
I understand what
who
you're saying. I'm trolling.
are running like, I don't know, 4x16, and my intuition is that it seems like a lot of cards for building a 40 card deck, but I can't like dismiss it outright.
No, and a lot of those people are also on extremely high densities of fixing, and so they had to basically go up in pack count and pack size to get enough playable cards and not just be drowning in non-basic lands.
I see this so much, and this is a whole other topic, but when people are designing commander cubes, and I've had this experience multiple times where I've said, look, the commander actually doesn't perform the same function in a drafted experience as it does in a constructed commander deck. You're not actually obligated to include commanders. You can just include the kind of set of cards you're interested in that create the kind of gameplay you're interested in, and multiplayer has a huge impact on that gameplay, so you can get a draftable experience with the kind of gameplay you like.
That's a classic Wave Dash situation. They think the thing that's good about Commander is having a Commander.
Right,
but actually, that's not what's good about Commander at all.
And it's another aspect where we really tie our identities, not just to Magic, but to a particular format of Magic. And they'll say, well, I'm a Commander player, so there has to be a Commander, otherwise I'm not doing my thing. And I think that, just like you're saying, questioning those assumptions and actually trying to get to the root of why are things working, or are these things that have just been like inherited from other formats, other contexts, and actually try and make the best decisions for what gives us happiness.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's like infinite space for coming up with something new, but I also appreciate that, I don't know, like my wife has been into playing like the new Pokemon MOBA, Pokemon Unite, and so I've been playing it a bit with her, and I don't want to like figure out all this stuff. I found some YouTube video which told me like which items to equip to my character, and then I'm done with it at that point. So I can also see that, like, you know, some people just like want Cube as like, you know, you buy a board game from a shop, and then you don't necessarily like want to go home and reinvent that game all the time. You just want something to play that is enjoyable.
Jason, I know you're taking a little bit of a step back from Magic, but is there anything you want to point people towards other than Riptide Lab and your articles on Channel Fireball while you're on the show?
Oh man, I guess I already plugged Slay the Spire. I've been doing some kind of internal testing on Roadbook, which is a game derived from Slay the Spire and designed in part by Richard Garfield. So there has some of that Magic DNA in it. Beyond that,
I just want to say I love hearing Richard Garfield talk and hear about how little he thinks about Magic. It's so inspiring to me that he made this thing that some people spend their entire life dedicated to and thinking about. And he's like, "Oh yeah, what does Library of Alexandria do again?" Yeah, right.
Well,
he's
to be fair, he's like made like I don't know how many games since then.
I know. I just think it's so great that like it seems like to him they're all just kind of equal. These are all games that I made, and yet this one thing has this like huge long tail of like extremely invested people behind it. And he's like, I think Bazaar of Baghdad also taps for mana. It's like, no, actually, that would be even more broken.
May we all strive to reach Richard Garfield's healthy relationship to his creative output.
Agreed. Jason, we got to have you back. I feel like there's more for us to talk about, so you got to join us again sometime in the future. Really, whenever you got something you want to talk about, or just whenever you feel like it, just let us know.
We don't even have to talk about Magic.
We barely did this time, so honestly, and I think that's fine. Thanks to everybody for tuning in to this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by my close personal design intern, Mark Rosewater, and Wizards of the Coast. Thank you to Anthony and Jason for talking about Magic with me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on yet again. Let's go play some Cube.
Three, 2, 1. And he gives me the worst claps every time without fail. That was just like a piece of leather just slapping onto a tabletop.
I can try to do a meteor
very
one.
Lightly. No, yours was good. It was Anthony's was all messed up.
Oh.
I could hear
it was all messed up.
it was just like,
I'm sorry, my weak.
That was actually much
that's
louder.
All you need. What more do you need?
It's fine. I have enough. I
you
have
like
enough
cushioning on your like hand clap motion.
Yeah, I have big fat hands
I
that just
mean that.
flop together.
Oh, I love Dominion as a mechanic. Oh wait, it's Domain. I haven't played Magic in a while.
I will open the sealed pack of Dominion cards.
That's a good example of a joke that gets cut out of the show. And no one ever hears it later.
Got it. I just didn't know how to respond to it. I was waiting for Anthony to respond.
If you don't know how to respond to a joke, then you didn't. It did not work. It's a failure of a joke.
I didn't feel like it was my place. I thought like, Anthony had priority and it was not like...
I got it. I didn't know how to respond is so much better or worse, depending on your perspective, that I got it. I just didn't think it was funny.